So thank you so much for joining us for this panel that will be looking at the role of technology and mentioning also AI and its role especially in the area of business and ethics. So to guide us in this forum and in this conversation, we have three people who will be guiding us in this, and we have our moderator, Calvin, from the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce. He will be guiding us in a conversation with Steve Nyikuli, Steve Suchi, who is with Ingressive Venture Capital, so looking at investment into tech companies, and we'll also be joined by Patrick, who is the head of ethics at Safaricom. So I'd like to welcome the three gentlemen up to the podium. Welcome. Let's give them a round of applause as they come up. Asanteni sana, please proceed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. We are going to start this panel by looking at the syntax of business, tech, AI, and the policies directly in Africa. Okay, so we're going to jump right off with you, Mr. Patrick. And your first question is going to be, how does Safaricom ensure ethical uses of customer and data AI in its operation?
Okay. So one of the things around the AI is definitely there's a lot of interest of late. I'm sure if I ask people to raise their hand, everyone will have used generative AI or some way without knowing you're using AI. Actually, your phone is actually full of AI tools actually that help you do a lot of things. Like you're cropping the image, you're removing some filters from the back, and that's purely AI. Now, if you look at Safaricom, I think we are one of the companies that has the highest, traffic in terms of the data. We know people probably see the stuff we could do with the data. Definitely, everyone will be afraid. So we know your spending patterns. If you're in M-Pesa, we know your calling patterns. We can estimate exactly where you are in life as well, and we can also do a bit of demographics, hyper personalization, and offer you product. So what we do there's a couple of things we do the safeguard to make sure that you're using the data properly. One of them is that internally we have a structure. We have a AI council that looks at the more ethical way of using the data sets, not over processing the data, access security around that, and checking the AI models that are coming out. They are actually predictable in the way they are showing up the data set. One of the biggest, actually, if you look at from a risk perspective then, is the potential for the models actually to give you the wrong data set and make decisions based on that. So if I look at the area of the fraud management, we really leverage a lot of that there. Product offering, credit because you give credit, and therefore things can go wrong. Either exclusion, one of them, data is wrong, improper access, transparency issues. So internally, what you've done is the council itself look at all the models, look at the efficiency of those models, the false positive, and some of the errors are coming through. Then try to direct those ones to get less and less actually errors within the data. And then, of course, you always have someone looking at the output just to make sure that it's correct.
Okay. Yeah. Now, I do have a question because Kenya is referred to as the Silicon Savannah, and we're looking at your market presence. However, AI remains entirely unregulated in the Kenyan space. Up until recently, the only AI regulatory mechanism was introduced and brought into effect in the European Union, and this was on October 4th. Now, because it has extraterritorial control, it is meant to be applied here, just the way we'd have the Data Protection Act 2019 governing the utility of data. So how is Safaricom, as a very strong market player, regulating and ensuring that AI will not be misused within businesses? And you yourselves, as a controlling body, how do you get to ensure that these systems have checks and balances?
Okay. So if you look from a data, specifically at the data level, so we got the data we generate from our platforms directly. But we have what I call complementary data coming out from the ecosystem. So, for instance, you've laid a product on top of the core platforms. Let's say is a fintech product, but your data. So all you see is a pipe with a bit of transaction, but you're doing a little bit more generation on your side. So that we don't have a bit of oversight of that because we are not the controllers and all that. Our element is when the data comes and goes through the pipe. I think one of the biggest challenge actually is that we are creating the controls without any regulatory environment. So really you have to think through, and I'll use an example, just talking to someone, asking them how they do business in an unregulated environment, say, oh, you take advantage, actually, because no one asks you questions. But actually, if you're really looking at more sustainable processes, you have to think, how do you then do the safe element around without necessarily having regulations? I know the EU Act definitely is just going to come to us. Even the data protection, actually, the first was, the EU Act for data protection that we adopted, actually, with a bit of local customization. And then if you look even at Bribery Act, the Kenyan Bribery Act is actually it's an offshoot from UK Bribery Act 2010, really. So the provisions, the 7 principles within the Act itself, within the EU AI Act, definitely is going to come to us. But also it's the right thing to do. If you're looking at the human agency oversight output, which is coming out. So, and then the tech itself might be consistent in terms of it, just pull out the data. In AI, there's a lot of terms like hallucination. Some of the data sets you just put in data in, and what you get is something completely off. So far, if you look at the maturity of the models, some of them could be potentially mature, especially on very specific niche industry. But I think from the processing, from internal processing of data, simply you can't just do a model and just go plug the data, start using that. So that has to be funneled through the council, which report the internal, management. And then, and we report, it's still a framework, which is still, we're just filling up any gaps on it, is that we really also report the board, in terms of how we're using the AI, and safely so, and which products are within the AI space. But one of the other things is actually also creating transparency to the customer, saying, there's still work to be done, saying this product is purely based on AI model, there's no human interventions. And then, of course, you fear about discrimination. You had stories about during COVID where some oxygen meters had a problem with the dark skin. So you put in, it tells you, okay, but actually your oxygen levels are low. I had the incident somewhere, I think, in Singapore or Hong Kong, where you are going to the executive gentleman room, and then the dispenser for the tissue, actually you use your hands. And then if your tone is dark, nothing comes out. You can imagine those type of things. So the biggest worry, actually, from where I sit, is that some of the technology are done from outside Africa. So the adaptation for our circumstances really has to happen in a big way. Because also, if you look at the data being fed in the large language models, we are generating very little of that content going inside there. So it's a very interesting area for us, actually, from an African context, whether the tools will create prosperity for us, or we create a bigger divide between us and the West.
Yeah. Now, in regards to the same, I recall hearing a conversation between Professor and another gentleman on his table in regards to AI utility in your institutions, because if we look at education and your higher institutions of education, they're still business models. So might you have any questions directly from Mr. Patrick on how this is affecting the performance of said individuals within your institution?
Okay, mine isn't really a question, but related to education, what I would say is that what we are doing with universities is basically saying to the professors and lecturers, that they should encourage students to use generative AI because you can't escape it and other forms of AI. So it becomes a question of creatively imagining good ways to use it. I personally find ChatGPT 4.01 dramatically useful in my research. What used to take me 5 days, I can now do it in 5 hours because the tools are very helpful in finding references for me. I can even ask the tools to summarize articles, which they will do in seconds. So they're very useful. And so in the universities that I work with, we've basically said to the lecturers and professors, tell the students to use the tools and then remind the students that ultimately you're at university to learn. And these tools are simply, in my opinion, like a modern textbook. Having excellent textbooks doesn't mean that you'll automatically become a smart student. Likewise, having excellent AI tools doesn't mean that the tools will actually make you a smart person or a successful, employable, skilled individual. It's how you use those tools. Just as the older tools were textbooks for the last X thousand years, and having textbooks around you doesn't really make you good at anything. You could have the best mathematics textbooks, but you know zero mathematics. Likewise, you could have excellent AI tools, but unless you creatively use those tools, they will not make you skilled and employable. So the role in education, in my opinion, is for us as teachers to find creative ways and encourage students to have creative ways of using these tools to make their learning more effective and faster, just the way it's making research for me faster. Thank you.
Now, with that in mind, we'd want to jump to Steve. And our first question for you would be, how can venture capital firms promote ethical business practices among startups? And what exactly is the support structure for this?
Okay. So thank you very much. I'm learning so much as I'm participating in this. I think one thing that's critical is we're getting into a space where startups are becoming the in thing now. No longer are we talking about hardcore tech. Everyone's coming up with something across on every corner, raising financing, raising funding, and there's a lot of money coming into Kenya. In fact, this year, Kenya is a leading destination for investor money in terms of the amount of investments we've been able to get in Kenya. It's actually leading of the big four, and by big four I mean South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt. So it tells you that there's a lot of funding that's coming. There's a lot of young people, founding companies, very unique solutions. Some, whether they're building for posterity or building just to be able to, acquire funding and then exit. We know those stories. We're not getting into that. But the reality is that from a VC point of view, we're not also a regulator. This is a field that's not regulated. It's not a field that has some level of control. What we come in as at early stage is to be able to come in and, as part of our due diligence, look at the solutions that are coming up. The key questions that we'll check, like criteria, do they have like an ethical council or a board? Okay, we look into things like the quality of the founders themselves. Do they have any ethical issues themselves individually, either from past behavior or any track record they've had? We look at things like what they're building. Does it have issues around diversity and inclusion, for instance? Does it have issues around data privacy that can be surfaced as businesses that will then not get us into trouble? Because VC money is not free money, right? At the end of the day, we come in, we invest, we want to be able to exit. We want the business to grow, but we want to be able to exit. The risk about investing in businesses at very early stages that don't have this kind of policies that Safaricom have is that we will, at VC level, check as a checkbox, so to speak, but wouldn't necessarily go into like the details of prove it to us, show it to us. And then you come in, you invest in a business, 2 years later, they're caught up with some fraud, around data breaches, around data privacy issues, around misuse of AI or algorithms and things like those. We end up losing funds. So the truth is, VCs in that particular space haven't necessarily played a critical role. But then at the end of the day, is it really the role of the VCs? We're operating in a space where, as Safaricom has said, or any other big brands, we're not super regulated. So guys are coming into this space to literally abuse it. Okay, so for us, our due diligence will not necessarily go into, because we don't have frameworks to be able to say this is an ethically sound business, and therefore, they can say whatever they want to say on a pitch. Okay, we're being competitive. What we can teach, though, is there's a space for being ethical in terms of doing business, especially for longevity. Okay, there's spaces for being, and ensure that we mentor the founders. We're ensuring that they have ethics at the center, the core and center of the operations. We look at things like ensuring that they have a data policy in place, that you can be able to verify and know that, whenever an issue comes up, there's a way to counter that. The reality is that all these things, most often they're not sitting in files, and hardly do the founders themselves go into them and sort of, surface them. And so it's a space that's very broad. It's a space that can be easily manipulated. Okay, for the better, for the worse, there are issues around it. The reality is that from a venture capital point of view, we haven't played a critical role in that sense, because what we really want to do ultimately, especially for us who are in pre-seed, very early stage, we want to invest in very, very low. We want to come in at very low valuations and exit quite quickly. All right. So most often than not, we will overlook some of these issues. But the reality is that is there actual frameworks in businesses in Africa that can be able to surface this? The businesses that are able to do that are doing, crazy valuations. They're probably not fundraising. They probably have structures in place that can then be able to have, or can afford to have teams that focus 100% on, compliance and governance and things like those. For startups, it's a level playing field, and I'm not telling people to go and take advantage of the fact that it's not heavily regulated. It's a reality on the ground. We can do our part in terms of ensuring, because we have board seats. We can make sure that there's standards that are that we abide by, but we cannot enforce it. Okay. Ultimately, we want to come in early, make our money, and exit, and therefore that's why we see a lot of these companies failing by the year 5, 6, 7. But by this time, early stage VCs like us have probably exited the scene, so we don't have much control, which is quite the reality.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that brings into question the prospects of corporate governance, due diligence enforcement, when we're looking at certain policies being introduced. So you introduced to us that this is it's an open playing field for anyone who wants to come in and take advantage. Now, wouldn't that fall under CSR and ESG policies, because you're looking at the sustainability of a business? If you're looking at longevity and not exiting at 2 years, you're looking at, let's say, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. Then how are you able to sit down and ensure that if you're not looking deeper into their policies?
It's a very good question. The AI data privacy issues and spaces in terms of ethics and generally running of startups is, like I said, very, very green, very untapped. You mentioned the idea of sort of having this kinds of roles sitting within the ESG spaces and all that, but I think we even had this morning, that's where they get lost. Because whenever you start talking about that, quickly the conversation moves to SDGs. It moves to anything else that, you can be able to measure things like climate tech or impact in terms of jobs or employment you're creating. But hardly do we ever get to the measure of data breach and data privacy and issues like that. The examples we give, especially around the ad tech space, where we're using all these models for research and all that, 100% support it, but who's feeding that information? Can we verify that information is true? Can we do we have policies in place that can be able to substantiate the data that is there? We're giving, recently, this country, we had those guys who are taking iris pictures and those lines across KICC, collecting all the data, rich data. We didn't have any regulation around it. It just felt wrong, and that's why we stopped it. But if we went to court, what law did we have to be able to abide against and say this is wrong and therefore should not have been done? There are experts in the field who can look at that from a compliance perspective. From a startup point of view, like I said, it's one of those areas that we really struggle with 100%. We have seen issues where a lot of founders come in and, they make amazing pitches. They build solutions which, on paper, they look amazing. but they can falsify that information. Sure. Okay? For VCs who are very interested in colorful pitch decks and things like those, there's all these AI tools. Gamma, for instance, sitting here right now, I can come up with a pitch deck in 5 minutes, go and pitch and get investments. You know, and VCs are very excited about those things. Eventually, when you look under the hood, there's literally nothing. And we have seen many companies that have raised a lot of money. I happen to have worked in one, for instance, and storytelling was a big deal. Okay, but storytelling was more an emotive thing, and AI can help us come up with very emotive stories and visuals. But at the end of the day, when it comes to actual under the hood, literally looking at what is there, a lot of these companies fail within 2-3 years. Now, the reality is that most venture capital firms, especially early stage, we're lazy. AI has made all of us lazy-ish. You know, we don't want to get into those details because, one, how do we measure that level of control? You hear billion-dollar companies like Safaricom that have that structure. That's what it takes. A startup that can be able to afford a team that they can pay salaries to just literally look at anything around data, input, output, look at how well it's being utilized, how that data, you know, in an ethical manner. Those are expensive outputs that a lot of companies that we're looking, especially the young guys who are coming to this space, we're not seeing that coming out of them 100%. And he will tell you what it takes to be able to set up those structures. I respect companies that actually have taken up a stand to want to be to ensure that, you know, they have these policies in place and they're actually adhering to them 100% and reporting even up to board level. For me, that's what builds sustainable businesses, which is Safaricom is where it is today, which is also why other companies, and I don't want to mention names, are not even a fraction of, you know, the longevity that we've seen with such brands. So therefore, I think it's important. We need to be able to preach that message. But the reality is that as investors, the earlier we can make our back, we're out, and that's where we're falling short. And I think that's an opportunity there for us to sort of learn from, you know, established brands to then be able to have some of these policies in place here.
Okay, so I think Mr. Kinoti would be able to speak on that, given that if they're looking at regulatory policies and established categories where you are essentially a benchmark, would you be able to publicize this to a general community for them to actually have awareness and education? Because we're looking at a younger demographic who are going to be able to employ this. It's more of a conversation of youth integration into business ethics, because it falls again under circular economy and sustainability. What would you say in light to that for the startups?
Okay, so if I look at our ecosystem and engagement, one of the things we've done, okay, let me dial back. So if you look at certain things which are not very strategic in nature, we tend to actually bring other people into the conversations. You look at core risk management, we have a forum we do with the banking industry, largely because they're also our adjacent industry with a lot of interaction within our platforms. I think if you look at then, we also run a couple of campaigns within the universities, actually. But remember, if you're looking at AI, the conversations are just started. You know. I remember in school, it used to be there, but no one used to bother because the technology was very rudimentary at that point. But now, if you look at the current trends, actually, if you look at every 3 years, there's a big leap actually in the technology. ChatGPT wasn't there actually in 2021. We start hearing about it, and then 2022, people start, it got open to the public. 2023 actually, and now, if you're not using it, definitely you're out. So I think there's a big opportunity actually but we do engagement, but I don't think they are structured in a way actually to start bringing these conversations actually into more structured ways. If you just bring the youth, then you need to see where the marketplace. And then now when you know the marketplace, you know what kind of conversations are you going to have. We do have certain elements, like in arts, that we're very, very strong. Technology, I said in cybersec, we're okay. But the use of AI and the ethics around that, the risks around that, I don't think those conversations have been very, very well articulated. And there's a reason, because it's very recent, that's number one. And number two, it's also changing pretty fast. I remember at the beginning of the year, from an organization perspective, we made a very conscious decision to make sure everyone knows about AI. And because it just increases productivity by X, times. So currently, if I'm doing a report, I do report, then anonymize the data, then throw it in Copilot, because that's one which we pay for, not ChatGPT, because I can't put corporate information on ChatGPT. So, but Microsoft does have the Copilot. I tell it what to do specifically and give me an output, and then I have to proofread it again. And remember also the usage, you have to know how to do the prompt engineering, what you really want. Actually can do amazing stuff if you know how to prompt engineer the models. So one of the things was the learning for everyone, the 6,000 plus all of us, is just how to use the basic tools to understand the risks. And then of course going through the awareness of the risks are the do's and don'ts. Just to make sure that also you're not feeding the AI with corporate information, because it's the IP element there. And then just to make sure the output also is usable in a way. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of opportunity to engage with especially the young people, because of the pipeline of your engineers will come in. So, and I can hear what Steve is saying. When you leave school, there's a certain element that, and remember the startups are normally done by younger people, so for them it's more functional than anything else. If it works, it's okay, but if you just scratch below, you realize, I think, if the business model, some of the things done there, probably if you run it through a security review, the code, you realize is completely problematic. But I can't blame them, actually, because also, I think the professor talked about it. I don't think things are engraved, actually, as you go through the school process. But actually, if I look at it currently, we do a bit of speeching in certain universities, who knows us. But I think those structures need to be there, actually. The people who are in the front line. If you look at the people who generate data in Kenya, probably Safaricom will be there, Airtel, big banks like Equity also will have very, very copious amount of data, which then become the foundation for other things that people are doing, actually. I think there's opportunity, especially for us to engage the innovators. But used to have innovators forum, but I think it died off after COVID. It's something probably learning come out, so that whoever is venturing using of AI, a product, then they need to actually to look at the risk elements. A good tool can be used for the wrong thing, and it's becoming a big problem, actually. If you look at the AI misinformation, deep fakes. Actually, the cyber crime actually is also big. I can actually generate a code that hacks people, right? Without necessarily having a lot of technical capability. So there's a lot of other dark side of it. But I think if you're cognizant of that, then you're able to put the mitigations in place to make sure that you can use it from a positive perspective. Okay. Yeah.
I just want to chime in. I think as we were discussing this earlier, one of the things that's, I know we sound like we're spelling a lot of doom into this space, but the reality is that there's a way to position it differently, especially for startups. There's a way to position this whole narrative different. We need to be able to start talking about ethics as a competitive advantage and not necessarily something we just, we live with it, it's done, it's dusted, take advantage, decide what you want. I think there's opportunities there. And what we are doing, and especially in my role as a marketing person, as a communications advocate, is to think about how do we front companies or organizations that are ethically sound and build narratives around it. So for instance, talk about Safaricom and the longevity of Safaricom in terms of trust for their users. We all have issues with Safaricom, we know that. Oh, they're expensive, oh, they're downtime, but we never leave them because of the loyalty. And why? Is because we can trust that our data is secure. At the very least, we can trust that if we go to find a solution somewhere within the Safaricom show, we will find a solution. All right. There's things around just being able to build credibility, with innovations that are coming up. There's things that some of these brands come up with that other brands have tried and failed because, but because they can be able to surface some of these things, some of the advantages around how ethical they are with data that they collect, we're able to just sort of foster some level of credibility. We can trust, we can be able to sort of connect with this brand almost to the point of defending this brand. So I think there's opportunities there in terms of communicating sort of sound, ethical practices, especially around the startup space. If you look at things like being able to create innovation. So for instance, yes, I know the ChatGPTs of the world have created some level of we call it convenience, but really there's a bit of laziness, And I love how the policy around Copilot is, yes, get the prompt, but read through and verify the data. The reality is that a lot of the stuff that's on some of these learning models are not accurate. And you can build a thesis around something that's not accurate and try and build a business around it without verifying it. There's a chance you will lose. I mean, I recently went through a pitch deck with some of our companies who were pitching, and how they defined their TAM, their total addressable market, was purely a prompt from one of his models, and it was not accurate for sure, because we actually have real data and we can look at it and be like, but this isn't right, But there are VCs perhaps who will look at that and think, yeah, fine, they know the market, give them the money. 2 years later, they can't validate that business. So there's a level of innovation that requires us to still apply our own knowledge, apply our own wisdom, And I love what Prof said. It's a question of using it as a tool. AI is like a gun, It's like fire. Bad servant, bad master, but great servant. So it's a question of how do you utilize these platforms ethically? How do you apply innovation in there? How do you surface governance issues that then can be able to build some level of trust? It's a long game. He can tell you they didn't start doing this today. It's a long game. Ultimately, these are the things that causes businesses to last however long they last. And I can tell you from a VC world, we've seen we've invested in about 52 companies now, and we're still deploying. We have about $9 million left to deploy in our fund too. And out of the 52 companies we've deployed, about 30 of them, we're already writing them off. Ideally because either they oversold, either they're not very sound in terms of how they make judgments because they're depending on some of these tools that perhaps are not giving them, accurate information, So that for me is a challenge. When you think about ethics, we need to think about it as an advantage, and we need to be able to surface those conversations. We need to be able to have businesses coming in saying, listen, we process your data, but this is how we are registered, we're regulated, we have a board, we have a council, we have, teams that are responsible for acting and ensuring and communicating that over and over and over again until it sits. Because the reality is this, and we had this conversation earlier, is we are coming up with innovations and solutions, but if you look at the population that we're dealing with, Africa right now, average age, about 80% of our population, even going into 2030, will be below the age of 30. Okay? I know the term policies and regulation are not very attractive to that demographic, but we need to be able to build narratives around that, to be able to then appeal to this audience, to then, yes, use technology, yes, use AI, yes, use all these data sets that we're gathering, but be able to be responsible about it and surface how they're actually being responsible. Because the trust game, everything we're discussing here is about trust. That trust game is a long game. When a brand or when a business is able to elicit that level of trust from their customers, you can be sure they'll be there and they'll play the long game. Okay, so that's sort of what I did.
I do understand that. We fully need to appreciate and indoctrinate these practices. But now I have a quick question right across the room. How many individuals own their own businesses right now? So we have quite a number. Out of the individuals who raised their hands, how many have tried automating their processes through technology? Now, out of those two, how much of this is facilitated by artificial intelligence?
Okay, for my organization, artificial intelligence has helped. It has helped. The work is now easier and the profits are higher. And so like 90% is automated, only 10% the sales part, and the manual part is only 10%.
Yeah, we're still trying to find the angle. Yes, we run a grassroots dairy firm that takes milk from pastoralists. So we're trying to first build the models of how they migrate, where they go to. There's still a lot of data gathering. We're still at those early stages before we can then build some kind of automated model for deciding where to put our solar-powered portable milk cooling systems that we've started to deploy, but it's mostly manual at the moment. So until we build all those data points and gather enough information, it won't be AI-driven. Yeah.
Thank you. So from this, we can easily deduce that for business ethics and the convergence of technology, it takes quite some time. So it's still at its nascent stage across the African landscape. Now, it goes back to the question of how is this now going to be introduced to a demographic that is not entirely tech-based, and how we're going to learn from these models. Now, back to Mr. Kinoti. What steps is Safaricom taking to balance innovation with regulatory compliance in tech-driven industries?
Okay, I think if you look at ourselves, I think we have two big regulators, like the Kenya CA, Communication Authority, and then you have CBK, because we run the financial product. Now, I think the big innovation, there are two levels. Is when you're doing the product for consumers, and then the internal process improvement, innovation. So two things. If I talk about the consumer product, we as a company, we are not allowed to give certain service, so you have to do it in conjunction with other partners, like lending product, savings, so we do with the partners. However, because the data sits within the organization, we're doing the model, credit lending, credit scoring, then hyper personalization. You're saying what's the next best action the customer will deal with. So we're using a lot of that. Now, as I said, the regulation around the consumption and utilization of the data doesn't exist in Kenya, really. Only thing you're told that protect the data. But of course, this element around the collections, how much you can collect, and that's stipulated within the data protection. But it doesn't actually disallow you collecting a lot as long as you have the safeguard for that particular data set. So the thing is then, if I collect a lot of information, then it's a responsibility I have to protect that particular data from unauthorized access, unauthorized processing, and of course the sharing element. So for those ones, I think we're doing a lot. I think we are the first organization to set up a data protection office way back in 2016, I think. And immediately GDPR actually came on. We took them, unpacked it, did the impact assessment, recruited someone to look at it, and they would tell the business, no, you can't use the data in this way. So from that perspective, from a regulatory compliance, because you look at that, we are largely okay. But there are a lot of other gray areas where there's no regulations. How do I process? How do I position my product? But ideal around the credit scoring, I think we do a lending product with the partners, with the people who have the license to do that. But I do believe because of the size also, you, as you said, you can employ people to do things. I can tell you, you're already looking at the EU AI Act, looking at exactly the 7 principles, looking at our practices and trying to actually reflect that. And it means by the time the regulations come, definitely you're ahead actually of everyone, and you're doing the right thing. But also looking at it also from a shareholding perspective, there's certain pressures that come out from some of our shareholders. We are affiliated to Vodafone, Vodacom. So because they are part of the bigger scope, we also pick a lot of learnings from that, which we implement within our organization. So, but as I said, I think it's ability to do it. However, you still can do it with your small. It's a mindset thing. You're saying, okay, how do I use the data? And you get consultants who can even support that particular environment. You may not necessarily do like you have a data protection officer, but you could use external, consultant to do that piece for you. Yeah. So I think that's what we're doing. Yeah.
Okay, and while we're looking at that specifically covers a lot of tech activity. So if you're looking at the business ethics perspective of it, you are a for-profit company. You still need to make your profit. And for you to meet those margins, how do you then draw a boundary between crossing ethical issues where you have particular group, a very large demographic of the Kenyan environment relying on you and not violating their specific rights as per the provisions of the Constitution?
Yeah, I think we do have a statement that say, what is it? It's actually, we say, I'm forgetting but actually it's something before profit, actually, in terms of the product you actually launch into the. So if you look from a NEVIC journey, actually, I think we started this one way back around 16 years back, trying to say, how do we create structures within the organization, or what do we want to be? How do you want to be viewed, actually? And then, of course, as a business grew, you realize actually you have a responsibility beyond the profit to actually influence the ecosystem you have around yourself. I think we're discussing someone today saying that we did support the establishment of the Business Code of Ethics in Kenya, supported the development of anti-corruption the bill as well. But I think the idea behind it was saying we used to be the biggest actually company with a lot of ecosystem suppliers around, and we say this can be our partner within the inner circle of trust. The expectation was just to create circles behind. So if you come in, you've done the right thing, so your supply ecosystem also have the similar values actually as yourself. So we've been this for quite some time. We normally have the platforms with our suppliers once a year where we talk about some of the things we're doing. And also we do sensing actually from a survey perspective. So tell them, okay, you tell us what you're doing wrong. And because it's an anonymous process, our expectation, the inputs actually are more, they're genuine actually. Then we take that. That become actually the program for the year, saying, okay, these are the elements where we are not doing very well. What do we need to do? And one of the things actually, you can digitize away certain, what I call wet areas interaction, the stuff. The entire procurement process for us is completely digitized. So you put your document yourself, you invoice actually from the platform. And these actually based on the learnings we've had, where there was rent seeking when you want someone to approve your invoice for payment. So we've really done a lot internally. But also think there's improvement room where we are looking at the intended actually ripple effect behind our suppliers, whether it's working. And one of the things was to create an ecosystem where people who know how they do business. So also you can increase the velocity of the transactions and interactions. I can tell you, and probably I know there's some people from Nigeria here, there are people from Kenya, and no one from Japan. If I was doing you're investing in startup actually, if a Japanese company really they don't need to call 22 lawyers to look at those documents because people will actually give you the right information. They won't try to cut corners. If you're doing Kenya or Nigeria, then you need to have a regulator. You have a lawyer on top. That lawyer might be conflicted, and then a second lawyer on top. So it actually slows the velocity of the transactions actually. And we need to fix that in Africa, by the way. Yeah, it slows investment. He is holding his money, which need to be actually hitting the ecosystem for 9 months. So there's a lot of things looking at it from a holistic perspective, and then saying, how do we need to do this? Yeah.
Thank you. I think the emphasis has been drawn on due diligence and the capacity for everyone else involved to actually look at the ethical practice and how they're going to integrate not only just technology, but best practice in the relevant industry that they're in. So thank you once again for taking your time, listening to us. And we hope that we're going to hear more from Safaricom in regards to business ethics and tech involvement for AI come 2025 with the EU Act, and for the venture capital environment, closer focus.
I'll just add and say, I think one of the things I've picked up from this conversation is ethics is not a roadblock. It's not a roadblock. It's a foundation for long-term success, longevity, and lasting positive legacy. It really is. And I think speaking from a venture capital fan, like I said, one of the things we're really struggling to do is find ethical people and businesses to invest in because we want to build for longevity. The reality is that funds are right now deploying. There's a lot of money coming in. We're sitting on $9 million now that we need to deploy in the next 6 months. If we can find ethical, young, tech-savvy founders who are building these things and can be able to surface some of these ideas that we're discussing. That really is the future that we're looking to build in Africa, and that's really what we want to be able to do to contribute to a meritocratic Africa. I think that really is where the challenge is. And so, I'm loving the conversation what Safaricom is doing. I think one of the things that we should be able to do is surface those kinds of stories across Africa, that it is possible. And Africa's biggest company has been able to do it. So therefore, if you're building for longevity, there's funding that's coming to support you to do that. But build with that in mind, and I think we'll be in a better place.
Thank you. So if we could have a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you for their time. Thank you.